You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today on the Useless Information Retrocast, you'll hear a number of fascinating, totally true stories, and that includes a 12-year-old boy who asked comedians Abbott and Costello, at the peak of their fame, to perform at a charity show that he was staging in his mother's backyard. Or how about a family who sued a dairy simply because their son had experienced a sudden growth spurt? Clearly had to be the milk. Plus, you'll hear the story of a young man who walked from Los Angeles all the way to New York City and then back just so he could win a $500 bet. Well, all those stories, the question of the day, today's retro sponsor, and so much more, they're all coming up next on this, the 36th edition of the Retrocast. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well. I have to tell you, things are going great on this end. And that's because my wife Mary Jane and I just returned from an 8-day vacation in Denver. Now I have to admit, I didn't work on the podcast at all. I did take a bit of a mental break, although I did read an entire book on the flight out there, and that'll be the subject of the next podcast. But of course, now I'm back, and it's time to get back into the usual routine, and that's what today's Retrocast is all about. And I really do believe you're going to love some of the stories that I tell you today. So let's dive right in. Here we go. On August 21st of 1922, a 20-year-old newspaper man named Fred Taylor walked into the offices of the New York Times with a very unusual request. He needed proof that he was indeed in New York City. So you're probably wondering, why would he need proof that he was in New York City and not somewhere else? Well, that's because he made a $500 bet, which is around $9,500 today, with an assistant manager of the Associated Press Bureau office in Los Angeles, known only by the last name of O'Malley. They never gave his first name. And to win the bet, Taylor had to walk from Los Angeles all the way to New York and back. Taylor explained.
The wager came about this way. I was sitting talking with O'Malley and a number of other newspaper men when O'Malley said, "You fellows are a crazy lot, you never take any exercise." I told O'Malley he was mistaken and that for half a cent I would walk from Los Angeles to New York and back again. O'Malley said, "I bet you $500 you don't." I accepted the wager, and the next morning I set forth.
So on June 3rd of 1922, Taylor left his home at 1842 Figueroa Street in Los Angeles. He had until November 13th to return home.
I had $122 with me when I started, but it did not last me to my journey's end.
Just for your reference, $122 is around $2,300 today.
Long before I reached New York, I found myself without a penny in my pocket and glad to work my way along doing odd jobs. The wager called for walking, but I was allowed under the terms to get lifts on trucks. Rides on tourist automobiles, passenger or freight trains, however, were barred. My route lay through Needles, California, Albuquerque, Raton, New Mexico, Trinidad, Colorado, Kansas City, Chicago, Columbus, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia. Altogether, I estimate I traveled about 4,878 days, which works out to about 60 miles a day, but the lifts I got in trucks must be taken into account.
For my international listeners, that 4,800-mile journey works out to around 7,725 kilometers. Now, as Taylor journeyed eastward, he did encounter several unexpected challenges. For example, he was arrested for vagrancy at one point. He had to endure a 36-mile or 58-kilometer stretch without any food to eat, and he faced a fierce sandstorm.
Just in Albuquerque, I ran into a terrible sandstorm. I was 5 miles along the highway when it blew up, and I thought I surely must be choked to death. I staggered along for 15 minutes with my mouth, eyes, hair, and nostrils getting fuller of sand every moment. When I thought I could bear it no longer, I stumbled across a broken-down wagon. Half blinded, I crawled into the lee side of the storm and buried my face in my coat. The storm lasted fully an hour. I tasted grit for a month. I found that my expenses were averaging about $1.80 a day.
That's roughly $34 today.
Most of the sum went for food as I naturally developed an enormous appetite. Nights I fell asleep in 2-bit flops, or if there was no other accommodation, in barns or haystacks. 4 weeks ago I arrived in Chicago, where I stayed for 2 days in order to visit my mother, whom I had not seen for 2 years. I had only $5 in my pocket, and when my mother learned of this, she begged me to accept further funds. I told her that I meant to win through on the sum which I had started. At Pittsburgh, I found it necessary to work 2 or 3 days in order to get a little capital to help me on my last stretch to New York.
Well, upon his arrival in New York City, he paid 50 cents, or about $9.50 today, to stay in a hotel in the Bowery. He also claimed that he had to have his shoes resoled twice and rehealed 3 times as he made that journey across the country. And after obtaining proof of his travels from the New York Times, he set out that very evening on his return trip, which he said would take him through Chicago, Denver, Salt Lake City, and finally back to Los Angeles. So I guess the big question is, did he make it and did he get the $500? And to be honest, I don't know. I have to tell you, I searched and searched and searched, but I couldn't find a follow-up story. I just didn't find out the answer. I mean, think about it. He'd already blown through the $122 that he left Los Angeles with. He was forced to work along the way to raise additional funds. So it's pretty clear he wasn't going to clear much profit if he did make it back to Los Angeles. Of course, there's also the possibility that when he reached Chicago again, his mother was able to talk some financial sense into him and, of course, bring a halt to his foolish journey. Now, if you're able to locate some information on whether he made it or not, just let me know. Just drop me a note. I'd love to hear from you. And now we're up to my favorite story today, and here's what I wrote. Fighting in a war is an expensive proposition for any country, and one way that the United States paid for its efforts during World War II was by, of course, selling war bonds. And to promote these bonds, the government enlisted the help of celebrities. Now today, if you want to enlist the help of celebrities, you'd record, a 30-second TV, public service announcement, or they would take to social media, but those weren't options back then. Instead, entertainers traveled from city to city to sell the war bonds. Among those celebrities were the comedy duo of Bud Abbott and Lou Costello, Abbott and Costello, who are probably best remembered today for their Who's On First routine. Now, if you've never seen that, I encourage you to go to YouTube. Just search out Who's On First. It is a classic. In fact, Abbott and Costello were so popular in their prime that they ranked among the highest paid entertainers of the 1940s and 1950s. And I'll just throw in that Wikipedia says that they were in fact the highest paid entertainers of that time period. But nothing could have prepared them for smooth-talking 12-year-old Jerry Young of Omaha, Nebraska. When he learned that the comedy duo would be in town to sell war bonds, Jerry, along with 2 friends in tow, they snuck into the upscale Fontanelle Hotel on Thursday, July 30th of 1942 to ask if they'd be willing to appear live on stage, get this, at a vaudeville show that he was putting on in his widowed mother's backyard a couple of days later. Imagine this. You're the most popular comedy duo on earth, and you're going to play in some kid's backyard. Now, the duo had an easy out, and that is that they were scheduled not only to perform in Lincoln the same day that Jerry was putting on his show, but they also had an appointment to meet with the state's governor there. Jerry, however, he was persistent. He explained that he was putting on this charity show to raise money for the Red Cross. Of course, Jerry would have to compensate them for their performance, so he offered them the astonishing sum of 70 cents. Yes, that's 35 cents each, or nearly $7 each today. I mean, how could they refuse? Believe it or not, they didn't. They agreed to do the performance. Of course, once the news broke that Abbott and Costello were going to headline, the ticket sales just skyrocketed. The price of admission to the show is set at 10 cents, which is roughly $2 today. And the crowd, it numbered more than 1,000 people, and Jerry was certain to make sure that they got their money's worth. That's because in addition to Abbott and Costello, Jerry had arranged for more than 50 people to perform. But I should probably point out they were all between the ages of 6 and 12. Well, the crowd eventually grew restless, watching an endless stream of youthful baton twirlers, tap dancers, singers, saxophone players, and so on. Let's face it, they were only there for one reason, that was to see Abbott and Costello. But the problem was they weren't there, and people began to wonder if they'd even show up. Then, with just 3 scheduled acts remaining, a car pulls up with the 2 entertainers inside. And get this, the police had escorted them the entire 55-mile or 88.5-kilometer journey all the way from Lincoln, Nebraska. But there was one more surprise, and that was that Father Flanagan himself, of Boys Town fame, had shown up, and he took to the stage to introduce the comedians to the crowd. And of course the 2 went through their typical comedy routine, and then they turned to auctioning off some of their photographs to help raise additional funds for the Red Cross. And for the icing on the cake, Bud Abbott decided to auction off Lou Costello's shirt. Now, if you're not familiar with Abbott and Costello, let's just say Costello was a bit on the heavy side. Not everyone wants to see him with his shirt off. And as the bids reached $10, Costello, he felt it would be better if he kept his shirt on, and he offered up the winning bid of $12, which is nearly $240 today. So in the end, Jerry Young raised $272, which is nearly $5,400 today for the Red Cross. Although really that's $271.30 if you subtract out the 70 cents he had to pay Abbott and Costello for their services. If I had to give a guess, they didn't take the money. On Monday, February 9th of 1948, a Los Angeles, California jury heard testimony related to a lawsuit that was brought by the parents of 13-year-old Edward Joseph Conradson. They sought $75,725 in damages from milk truck driver Hugo Nielsen and his employer, the Silver Shield Dairy. Now that $75,000 and change may not seem like much today, but it's really about $1 million adjusted for inflation. According to the complaint, on July 7th of 1946, Edward was riding on the side of Nielsen's milk truck and he was clinging to a crate of empty milk bottles. Then, as the truck rounded the corner of Joanna and McBruin Streets, Edward had nothing firm to hold on to, so he just went flying in a straight line, and then he landed on the hard road surface below. Now just throw in here that I couldn't find either of those streets on Google Maps. I believe Joanna Street is actually Joanna Avenue and McBruin Street is McBroom Street because those two do form a corner on Google Maps. Anyway, as one would expect, the parents were suing for the injuries that Edward received in the accident. But his injuries, they were quite unusual. They insisted that the accident had damaged his pituitary gland and that caused a sudden growth spurt in Edward. His parents claimed that prior to the accident, the boy was just 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 150 pounds. In the metric system, that's about 158 centimeters tall and 68 kilograms in weight. But now he stood 6 foot 1/2 inches tall and weighed 197 pounds or 184 centimeters and 84 kilograms. Supposedly no one else in the family had what the press was calling gigantism. Now I'm about to throw a pile of numbers at you, don't worry about it too much, but here we go. Mom was 5 feet 4 inches tall and 145 pounds, which works out to roughly 163 centimeters, 66 kilograms. Then there was 26-year-old sister Mary, who was 5 feet 7 inches tall and 130 pounds. That's roughly 170 centimeters, 59 kilograms. And finally, they gave the example of 18-year-old brother Jewett, who was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed in at 145 pounds. That's roughly 180 centimeters and 66 kilograms. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, but the 18-year-old brother is just 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters shorter than his 13-year-old brother. Is that really gigantism? I mean, clearly there wasn't much height difference between the two brothers, but the parents, they were arguing that Edward was unusually tall for his young age. So if you were sitting on this jury, which way would you decide? Well, the jury returned a verdict in just 17 minutes. They ruled in favor of the dairy, and of course that meant that the Comrades received absolutely nothing for the son's sudden growth spurt. One of the places we hiked while we were in Colorado was the El Dorado Canyon State Park. And there we were looking at the Continental Divide, and I began to wonder just how many trees are there on Earth. I mean, the mountains were just covered with trees. How many trees are there on Earth? And so I just pulled out my phone and quickly looked up the answer, and then I turned to Mary Jane and gave her a similar question. I just did a little bit of math, and I asked her, how many trees are there for each person on Earth? In other words, take the total number of trees and divide it by the number of people on Earth, and you'll get a ratio. Maybe, for every person on Earth, there's 10 trees or 100 trees or 500 trees or 722 trees or 1,000 trees. How many trees are there for every person on Earth? So I'm going to ask you the same question. How many trees are there on Earth for each living person? And clearly there's no exact answer. I mean, no one knows the exact number. We only have estimates of the number of trees on Earth. So just take your best guess. Well, as always, I'm going to leave you in suspense for a bit, and I'll let you know the answer at the end of this podcast.
Thousands of people who suffer the social and business handicap of dandruff are discovering that the way to combat it effectively is with double danderine. You see, double danderine is unlike many hair preparations available today. For such products really do no more to fight a common type of dandruff than plain water does. That is, they simply wash loose dandruff away. But double danderine actually combats this dandruff by killing the germs that many outstanding authorities contend are its cause. And double danderine kills these germs on contact. Now, a special ingredient named Alzan is the reason for double danderine's amazing effectiveness. Alzan is an active antiseptic so remarkably efficient, many hospitals use it. And of all hair preparations, only double danderine has it. So try double danderine and see if you don't agree that most ordinary hair preparations can't compare with its dandruff-combating effectiveness. If you're not satisfied, return the empty bottle and get your money back. Buy double danderine at your druggist.
That commercial for double danderine is from the March 12, 1946 episode of Bride and Groom. The show ran on the ABC radio network from November 26 of 1945 through September 15th of 1950. The show claimed to have married nearly 1,000 couples during its 5 years on the air, although I should point out that the wedding ceremonies themselves were never broadcast. Instead, host John Nelson would begin the show by asking the couple how they met and about their courtship, and once that was completed, they'd be escorted to an adjacent chapel where one of the 30 or so clergy that was retained for the show would marry the couple. A little tidbit about the show is that they never married Catholic couples, and that's because Catholic couples were required to get married in a Catholic church. Of course, they couldn't provide that while they were broadcasting. Anyway, while that short ceremony was happening off the air, there'd be a song, and then Nelson would talk to the other couples in the audience. Maybe they had a milestone anniversary of, say, 50 or 75 years. And then, of course, the newlyweds would return to the microphone. And when they did that, there'd be a little discussion, and of course, they received their wedding gifts from the show's sponsors. The show was adapted to TV in 1950, and if you want to know more about that, I strongly encourage you to go check out episode number 121 of this podcast. I titled that one, The First Jewish Couple Married on National TV. Indie cartoonist Lee Rubin, and you may be familiar with his popular Rube syndicated cartoon, I know I was prior to interviewing him. He came on as a guest and talked about his parents, of course, being the first Jewish couple ever married on TV, just as the title says. But best of all, when his parents were done being married on the show, they were sent home with a film of the broadcast. Now, Lee had that, and he transferred it to DVD, and I ripped the audio, and that's all spliced in with the interview that I did with him. By the way, they were married on October 25th of 1951. I have to say, it's one of the most memorable episodes that I ever did. Again, it's episode number 121, The First Jewish Couple Married on National TV. And I strongly encourage you to check that out. And what I'll do is I'll place a link not only to that episode, but also to the complete video of Lee's parents getting married on Bride and Groom. I'll put those two links in today's show notes. Now, as for the sponsor of this particular Bride and Groom episode, that's Double Danderine, I was able to piece together just a little bit of its history. It was first marketed as Danderine Scalp Tonic in 1895 by the Knowlton Danderine Company of Chicago. Now, I don't have an exact date, but by 1907, Danderine was acquired by the Neuralgiline Company, and they later changed their name to the better-known Sterling Drug. Oddly, Danderine wasn't marketed for dandruff. I mean, it was implied that it did that, but that's not what they were selling it as. For the first 5 decades or so of its existence, they sold it as a hair conditioner and styling gel. And many of its pre-World War II ads show women and young girls with this incredibly lustrous long hair, and they all claimed that Danderine, of course, was responsible. Now, the implication of those ads, and it was never really stated, was that it was a hair-growing tonic, which, of course, today we know is all a bunch of bunk. Of course, styles changed, and by the 1920s, short bobbed hair was popular. So what did Danderine do? They just changed their marketing. They now claim that the product made one's hair, quote, appear twice as heavy and plentiful, unquote. So you may be wondering what was in it that made the hair twice as heavy and plentiful. Well, that version of Danderine was mostly alcohol with some borax, glycerin, and some other minor ingredients mixed in for good measure. And that included some aspirin, some pepper, and some other things. As for the reason for the fullness, it was really simple, and that's that women didn't wash their hair very often, and the glycerin and the borax would stay behind in the hair. Which got me thinking one of the implied uses of this product was to control dandruff, but you also have borax falling out of your hair at the same time. Not exactly what someone wants. Well, in 1940, they did change the product's name to Double Danderine, as you heard in this commercial. And they mentioned that the active ingredient was Alzan. Well, I looked it up, and that's alkyl dimethyl benzyl ammonium chloride. And that is a broad-spectrum antimicrobial. Plus, they also added a little under 10% of alcohol. Now, you can't buy the product today. It is long discontinued. And the last print ad I could find for Double Danderine was from 1978. Now we're up to the section I've been calling Footnotes to History, and these are 5 short stories that really require no further research on my part, so I'm just going to read them word for word exactly as they were written decades ago. And this first story I've had in my collection for quite some time. I can tell by the format that I saved it as that this probably goes back to the early days of the podcast. And this was published on December 24th of 1909 in the Michigan News Palladium on page 5. And the headline on this one reads, "Only slept 2 hours each day for 33 years, fall reverses things. Special to the News Palladium, Kalamazoo, December 24th. Henry Stephen of 621 East Main Street, who, following an accident to his head, slept an average of 2 hours and worked an average of 20 hours each day for 33 years, finds his condition reversed on account of striking on his head in a fall on the ice Saturday night. Nature's wonderful balancing power is now asserted in the remarkable case of Stephen. He is disposed to sleep all the time. Loss of nearly 100,000 hours of sleep seems to bear heavily on him now. In addition, he experiences a physical sensitiveness that is new. For 33 years, ordinary bruises and burns did not even inconvenience him. Now he is as easily hurt as the average man. When 19 years of age, Stephen was struck on the head by a brick. Ouch. Skin grew over the hole. He had no desire to sleep and only took naps. For 8 years, he has lived in Kalamazoo, being regularly employed at the Kalamazoo Stoveworks, mainly at night. In daytime, he did odd jobs for various people rather than toss in his bed. A fall on a sidewalk altered his life. While downtown, he slipped on the pavement, and soon thereafter, a huge swelling formed on his head where he was formerly hurt. Gradually, this decreased until the indentation in his head was closed, and now he wants to make up for the sleep he lost during the past 33 years. He can work, but when standing still, sitting down, or reading, he immediately falls to sleep. Figuring 8 hours of slumber for every 24, During the past 33 years, Stephen has lost 96,360 hours of nature's most valuable cure, and he does not seem to miss it. At present, however, he cannot sleep enough, and after dozing off it is almost impossible to awaken him. Dr. John Fletcher has been his doctor for several years and has called in numerous other doctors, but they cannot make out the case. It is the only one on record where a human being could go practically without sleep. Stephen has another peculiarity. He has at different times broken bones on his hands and feet, but instead of being laid up, he has continued working. Employed in a foundry, he was often burned, but the injuries did not seem to affect him, and he continued working, paying little or no attention to the wounds. He hopes soon to overcome the sleeping feeling as he is gradually growing normal. Next up, we have a story that was published on April 11th of 1931 in the Leader Post. That's in Regina, Saskatchewan in Canada, and this appeared on page 28. The headline on this one is Ancient Ham Still Edible, Dewsbury, which I should point out is in the UK. The licensee of the Shepherd's Boy Inn, Huddersfield Road, Dewsbury, Mr. J.W. Stevenson, can boast the possession of a ham 30 years old, which is as edible today as it was when cured. The ham, which is probably the largest in the country, weighs 100 pounds, which is around 45 kilograms, and on being seen for the first time gives the impression that it is petrified. This is due to the fact that Mr. Stevenson discovered the novel method of preserving the ham by periodically giving it coats of lime wash. When the lime begins to crack or falls off, this is due to the curious handling of the ham, Mr. Stevenson coats it again, otherwise the exposed part of the meat would go bad. Now, I did try to find out what happened to the ham after this, and I couldn't find anything. As for the Shepherd's Boy Inn, it did stay open for many, many years after this and only recently closed. This third story was published on August 11th of 1932 in the Troy Times, that's Troy, New York, on the front page. Unusual situation, Chicago, August 11th, Associated Press. Most persons would find it impossible to do what Walter Kent, 60, did last night. His right leg was broken off when he was struck by an automobile driven by William Kelly. Seizing the leg in his hand, Kent hopped over to Kelly's car and argued. Police Sergeant William Dillon intervened. "It's only fair," said the officer to Kelly, "that you should pay for having the leg fixed up again." Kelly finally agreed and drove away with Kent looking for a carpenter shop where the wooden leg could be mended. This story was published on February 12th of 1950 in the Decatur Daily Review on the front page. The headline on this one is Buzzing Suitcase Mystery Finally Solved by Police. Los Angeles, February 11th, Associated Press. A buzzing suitcase which had kept police and employees in a furor all day at Los Angeles International Airport was found to contain nothing but an electrical vibrator today. The suspicious suitcase, discovered this morning at 1 a.m., had been guarded and placed at a remote location on the airport until 2 police officers finally opened it late today. Sergeant Russell Camp and Inspector John Donahue went to the piece of luggage and pried it open with a file. They found the battery-operated vibrator. It was turned on and still buzzing when they opened the suitcase. In New York, relatives of an American Airlines passenger, H.S. Harrison, who flew from here last night, said they believe the suitcase is one accidentally left here and harmless. They said it contained a portable massaging machine connected to a battery which could account for a humming sound coming from the suspected bag here. Harrison's family was informed that the airline was sending his missing bag to him. The bomb suitcase had been at a remote location of the airport late today as police conferred with 2 Army ordnance experts while trying to verify the Harrison identification before opening the bag or sending it east. And lastly, we have a story from June 24th of 1960. This appeared on the front page of the A section of the Cedar Rapids Gazette. The headline on this story reads, "Burp could have started a blaze. Glen Rock, New Jersey, Associated Press." When John Culper's too let out a burp, his babysitter thought she smelled something funny on his breath. "Would you show me what you've been drinking?" Miss Alice Green asked John Thursday. With a happy gurgle, the tot took his sitter out to the front lawn and pointed to the power mower. Now Miss Green recognized the smell. It was gasoline. Get this. Next to the open tank of the mower were two straws. The tank was drained dry. John's stomach was pumped at a hospital, and he was released without any ill effects. So early in the podcast, I'd asked you, for every person on Earth, how many trees are there? And to do that, we need to know two numbers, and I should point out that both are constantly changing. First, we need to know how many trees there are on Earth, and second, we need to know the world population. Well, it turns out there was a study published in the September 2015 edition of Nature, and it was titled, quote, "Mapping Tree Density at a Global Scale," unquote. And it attempted to estimate the total number of trees on Earth. The number that they came up with was 3.04 trillion trees, and they found that about a third of those were in tropical and subtropical zones. But perhaps the scariest part of the study was that they estimated that since the beginning of human civilization, we've reduced the total number of trees by 46%. That's nearly half. And of course, that says nothing about the tree height, the diameter of the trees, whether you have old growth versus new growth forests, and so on down the line. Anyway, I just did some rough calculations here. In 2015, the world population was around 7.47 billion people, which works out to around 407 trees per person. I did check all-knowing ChatGPT, and it claims that there are 422 trees per person. But I have to tell you, either way, whether it's 407 or 422, that's a lot lower than I thought it was. But there is a problem here, and that is that the study estimates that we're losing about 10 billion trees per year. Now, it's been 10 years since, so 10 billion times 10 is 100 billion trees. We've lost 100 billion trees in 10 years. But at the same time, the world population's gone up. Instead of 7.47 billion, we now have around 8.2 billion people on Earth. Do the math, and that works out to around 359 trees per person on Earth. Now, I don't know what you're thinking, but to me, that's a fairly significant drop. In 10 years, it's dropped from 407 to 359 trees per person. Wow. Well, that wraps up the 36th edition of the Retrocast. Be assured I'm currently researching the next full-length story, but I did stumble across some information yesterday that suggests that part of the press coverage on it may be inaccurate. So in order to get a full picture, I'm going to request a book through Interlibrary Loan. Supposedly that describes it better, but that could take a week or 2 or 3 to arrive. It really depends on where my local library is getting the book from. So just be aware that could delay things a bit, but just stay tuned. I'll post that story as soon as it's completed. The Useless Information Podcast is available on all major podcast platforms, and of course many of the smaller ones also, so hit that follow button if you've never done so before. The Useless Information Podcast is proud to be part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so visit airwavemedia.com to explore their ever-growing collection of some of the very best podcasts out there. Anyway, I'll be back shortly with the next episode, so stay tuned for that. As always, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.